be back at Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge, Senator Florida. I am regarded as your conservation president. A bit of an odd thing for a man born in New York City, New York. When I was growing up on Manhattan Island, why, even then, when New York was a city of 1 million people and 500,000 horses, covered in sewerage of all sorts and by a heavy black soot from the coal fires that we burned in the fireplaces, diseases like cholera and typhoid ran rampant. But even then, a child could find nature. Nearby Gramercy Park, Mr. Olmsted's great Central Park with the American Museum of Natural History on the west side. When I was a little boy, the charter for that great museum was signed in the Roosevelt family living room. My father recruited its first director. A Roosevelt family member's been on the board since its inception. Of course, some of your children and grandchildren might have liked that movie, Night at the Museum. There's that fellow Robin Williams who pretends to be me. Imagine that, a man pretending to be somebody he's not. When I was a little boy growing up in New York City, my parents indulged me in my interest in natural science. And so I collected snakes and bugs and turtles and birds, squirrels and rats and mice, alive or dead, it did not matter. I brought these creatures home and had on the 4th floor of our home something that we called Roosevelt's Museum of Natural History. A very wide-ranging, though as any mother might suspect, a truly malodorous collection. You had to be careful coming to my house. If you poured yourself a glass of water from the pitcher, a snake might fall out of the pitcher and into your glass. Well, that's why I was keeping my snake cool. If you reached into the icebox for a snack, you might pull out my collection of mice awaiting my experiments. One afternoon, I was walking up Broadway Avenue. I saw Mrs. Hamilton Fish, wife of the United States Secretary of State, walking down. I thought I should have some display of gentlemanly conduct, in hopes that a report of my gentlemanly conduct might go home to my mother, much to my own benefit. Pride before the fall. As I passed Mrs. Fish in the street, I tipped my hat and wished her good day. And when I did so, 2 frogs fell out from beneath my hat and fell upon her shoes. I'm afraid that the report that went home was not of my gentlemanly conduct. I wonder that my life and legacy are associated with the great outdoors, with the western states. Until recently, I could say I was the only president born in New York City. Of course, the other fellow of some recency is from Queens. I'm from Manhattan. When I was a little boy, far from living the strenuous life in the great outdoors, I was a very weak and sickly child. I had asthma. Any of you who has asthma, or if you have asthma amongst your family or friends, well, you know what a terrible disease that is. To see a small child choking for breath and for life itself. Today, thankfully, the asthmatic child has the inhaler to restore breath, hopefully quickly. In my day, we had no such medicine. In my day, the treatment for asthma was worse than the disease. Can you imagine giving a small asthmatic boy a cigar to smoke? Oh, the idea was that coughing would stimulate my breathing. I was given bitter black coffee to drink, again as a stimulant. Became quite addicted to the bean as an adult. As your president, I drank 1.5 gallons of coffee each and every day. When I was your president, traveling down the Mississippi by riverboat and then disembarking at Memphis, took the train to Nashville. In Nashville, I begged the ladies of the Hermitage Society. I said, I just need to have a meal at the General's table. Andrew Jackson's table, the Hermitage. I had luncheon with the ladies. They spent the entire luncheon lobbying me for federal funding for a new plumbing system for Old Hickory's house. I included just such a request in my subsequent message to Congress, the State of the Union. Congress appropriated the funds. Those of you from Rocky Top will understand the ladies of the Hermitage Society are still a very influential set. When I finished my luncheon in Nashville, I finished my coffee. I turned to my hostess, herself a descendant of General Jackson. I said, Madam, that coffee was good to the last drop. The coffee was from the Maxwell House Hotel, downtown Nashville, Tennessee. Cheek Brothers proprietors. I'm told that after my demise, Maxwell House Coffee made a lot of money off of advertisements selling coffee, telling that incident from Nashville. Mind you, not a penny in royalties for the Roosevelt family. But as a little boy then with my asthma, I can remember amongst my first memories being 3-4 years old and hearing my parents speak outside my bedroom door as if I might not survive the night. My father, Theodore Roosevelt, the man for whom I'm named, the greatest man I ever knew, he got me breath and got me life, often by holding me aloft through the night and walking the halls, or when my asthma was at its worst, having the horses brought round to the front of the house in the middle of the night, tied to the carriage. And with me bundled in blankets in the front seat of the carriage, my father would speed that carriage through the streets of New York in the hopes of rushing air to my young and sickly lungs. Physicians today tell me that rather than the speed of the conveyance, it was likely the excitement of the ride that naturally produced adrenaline in my bloodstream and assisted me to breathe. When I was a boy of 11, still very weak and sickly, so much smaller than the other boys my age, my father called me into his study for a heart-to-heart talk. I knew the seriousness of the subject to follow, for rather than calling me by the diminutive nickname by which I was known in the family, TD, he said, "Theodore, you have the mind, but you have not the body. Without the aid of the body, the mind cannot go as far as it otherwise should. It is hard work and drudgery, but you must make your body." I said, "Father, I shall." And I set out to make my body with calisthenics. I lifted weights. I swam. I rowed. I worked on the parallel bars and on the rings. I even took boxing lessons in the classical manner. And I built my body. And it does appear I may have overdone it just a bit. But when I was your president at 5'8" and 220 solid pounds, I was but a mere feather of a man compared to my successor, William Howard Taft. At times, President Taft tipped the scales at over 350 pounds. When I was your president and Taft our governor in the Philippines, we had word that Taft was in ill health with fever, perhaps near death. My Secretary of War, Elihu Root, cabled to the Philippines, inquiring as to Taft's health, and thankfully Taft cabled back, "Health fine. Rode horse 20 miles this morning." Root cabled back, "How's the horse?" When I was a young man in New York City, my father gave me a gift when I was a boy of 13, a gift that changed my life. It was my first gun. A double-barreled breech-load shotgun of French manufacture, a perfect sort of gun for a boy and his friends, for we could not break that gun. In order to open the breech, we often had to bang it with a brick. The first time I took that gun out shooting birds along the Hudson River, there the discovery. My friends could shoot birds in trees where, for me, the trees themselves were blurry and indistinguishable. On our return trip to the city, my friends could read billboards and advertisements at a distance where, for me, the words and letters were illegible. It was at that late date in my childhood that my father knew to have me tested and fitted for my spectacles. And how creation came to life for me when I had my glasses. My drawings of birds improved greatly. My shooting of birds did not improve all that much. Perhaps like some of the sportsmen here, I always made up for in volume what I lacked in accuracy. I did not shoot well, but I shot often. Usually often and well enough to bag the game. I'm delighted to be in Florida. I first came here in 1898. The cause of Cuba Libre. Oh, and for some of you gentlemen, I need to explain, that doesn't mean a rum and coke. It was the cause of Cuban independence from the Spanish monarchs. I'd been the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I'd been calling for war with Spain over the treatment of the Cuban people. And indeed, when war came, February 15th, 1898, the battleship Maine blown up in Havana Harbor. I was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. I said it was an act of Spanish treachery. President McKinley was our last president to have fought in the Civil War. He'd seen the great decimation of war, and he did not want to rush. We built a dry dock around the Maine, around that ship on which 267 American sailors and Marine had died during the explosion or by drowning in the moments after. When the dry dock was pumped out, it was seen that the side of the ship was stove in, meaning an external explosion. In your generation, you've read and heard and probably even discussed the idea that it was some sort of spontaneous combustion of the coal dust that blew up the ordnance within the ship, that it was some sort of American mistake of our naval operations that led to the blowing up of the Maine. Poppycock, it was Spanish treachery. Admiral Rickover, in modern times, during the Carter administration, he who founded our nuclear navy, he and some engineers and computer models had an idea that it was an internal explosion, but that it was so hot that the sides of the ship being exploded out became molten and got pushed back in again by the pressure of the water. Poppycock. I wasn't willing to be called an armchair jingoist, to being a man willing to fight the war from behind the safety of a desk at the War Department. Congress passed a statute allowing for the raising of 3 volunteer regiments of cavalry, and I was given the opportunity to lead the 1st United States Volunteer Cavalry. In a moment of rare professional humility, I turned down the offer to be the commanding officer. I told Secretary of War Alger that I'd only been a captain in the New York National Guard, and I thought I might need a week or 2 of combat experience in order to lead the regiment. I asked that my friend, Colonel Leonard Wood, the White House surgeon, he for whom the Army fort in Missouri is named. Some of you may have trained there or sent your children for training there. Well, he'd already been awarded the Medal of Honor for being in at the capture of Geronimo in the Southwest. I asked that he lead the regiment, I be his second in command. He began to train the men in San Antonio while I worked with the quartermaster's office to see that we were properly requisitioned. We met all of the men from Arizona Territory, New Mexico Territory, Oklahoma and Indian Territory in San Antonio, Texas. When the regiment was expanded, I was allowed to accept some of the 20,000 volunteers who had written to me by letter and telegram volunteering for the regiment. So I was now able to accept my friends from Harvard and Princeton and Yale, from the gentlemen's clubs of Boston, New York, and Washington, D.C. Well, most of the regiment, those men of the Southwest, they were lumbermen, ranchers, miners, former members of the United States military out adventuring in the Southwest. You might wonder how these Eastern gentlemen got along with these Western characters. It speaks well of the men of the East that whereas in previous wars they might have thought themselves entitled to officerships simply by birth and breeding, these men of the East volunteered to be cooks and orderlies, ordinary troopers, anything they might do to assist the cause of the American government in Cuba. One of my New York friends came rather later than the others to San Antonio, came by train on a Sunday, wearing his Sunday best and his straw hat. On his arrival, he inquired as to my whereabouts. He was told that I was last seen down by the stables. When he arrived there remained but 2 cowboys who had spent the day breaking Texas-bought horses that were supposed to have been broken before we purchased them. One of those horses remained unbroken, unlike the leg of one of the cowboys thrown by that horse early in the day. That man missed the entire war. My cowboy friends, meeting my New York friend, thought they'd met their mark. They winked at one another. They said, "Colonel Roosevelt is on yonder hill, but you may have this horse to go and find him," giving my friend the unbroken mount. My friend jumped into the saddle of that horse, took the reins, took immediate control of that wild animal, and rode off successfully to find me, leaving the cowboys with their chins atop their boots. They had just attempted to have fun at the expense of the United States amateur riding champion. The good people of San Antonio threw us a wonderful fiesta when word came that we were off for Tampa. The park was lit at night by electric lights. The local maestro composed a symphony, at the crescendo of which was a cavalry charge, 2 small cannons to be fired in the timpani. At the party, when the cannons were fired, one of my Rough Riders in the back of the audience, perhaps lubricated, he stood up, pulled out his pistols, and said, "Let's help him out, boys." Began to fire his pistols. Women shrieked, tables overturned. One of the bullets nicked the electric wire, leaving the park shrouded in darkness. When order was restored from the chaos and pell-mell and the lights restored, it was discovered that during the darkness there had gone missing 3 barrels of bottled iced beer. Hence the phrase "empty soldiers" outside the picket line in the morning. We took our train across the old Gulf Coast, and how it did my Knickerbocker heart good. When that train stopped at the southern depots, out from the village would pour Southern belles, carrying buckets of milk and coffee, trays of baked goods, where but a generation and a half before their parents and grandparents had fought to tear the Union asunder. Now the gray and the blue were united beneath the red, white, and blue. The commanding officer of all cavalry in Cuba was the former Confederate cavalry officer fighting Joe Wheeler of northern Alabama. 65 years old, President McKinley asked him to step aside from a seat in Congress to take up a major generalship in the United States Army against which he'd fought 3.5 decades prior. At Tampa, Florida, train cars and men piled up. No one seemed to know who was in charge, where to go, or what to do. One newspaper man wrote that the United States had an army of occupation, and they were occupying the veranda of a grand hotel in Tampa. Today you can visit the Plant Hotel in Tampa, now the headquarters of Tampa University. It explains why there's so many Spanish cannon on that lawn. Word came, off to Cuba we would go. Sad the day was, 1/3 of the Rough Riders would be left behind for lack of transport. Grown men cried for not getting into the war. Worst yet, all of the horses for the enlisted men would be left behind. Our mules transferred to a regular regiment. When we left Tampa Harbor, the lights receding in the background, the sound of squadron bands and four-string quartets wafting from shipboard to shipboard, we toasted the regimental toast. To the officers, may the war last long enough that we're all either wounded, killed, or promoted. And we were. In Cuba, I had my crowded hour. I led the charge up Kettle Hill, July 1st, 1898. There were so many illnesses in the general officerships. General Shafter, so sick and fat with gout, he barely got off the boat, brought up to the front lines by a heavily burdened wagon. General Wheeler, in leading troops at Las Guasimas, our first engagement with the Spanish. General Wheeler was a fighting bantam cock, always put himself in the front lines. When we routed the Spanish, General Wheeler was beginning to suffer from yellow fever. In the excitement of the battle and in the early stages of his fever, he was heard to shout out, "After 'em, boys! We got the damn Yankees on the run!" I was fortunate to get into the action in Cuba, fortunate to get out, and fortunate to rise like a rocket in politics afterwards. The troops, the Roosevelt's Rough Riders, were quarantined at Montauk Point, Long Island. President McKinley came to visit. The Republican bosses in New York State sent an emissary asking if I would be the candidate for the governorship in the Empire State that fall. The Republican incumbent mired in controversy and malfeasance over the Erie Canal. When the men mustered out at Montauk Point, my regiment presented me with the Remington sculpture, the Bronc Buster. Sometimes it resides in the White House today. I was the Republican candidate for the governorship, was elected by a slim 17,000 vote margin, began to fight to deliver a square deal to the people of New York. In the cause of conservation, I professionalized the game wardens in New York State, having discovered as a newly elected governor that most of the game wardens had purchased their position through politics, and most, if they wanted to do their job, had to hire a guide to take them out to the lakes and the forests for which they had charge. We instituted the first interstate park, the Palisades, along the Hudson River with the state of New Jersey. I fought against corruption and the influence of Wall Street. That was too much square dealing for the Republican bosses. They decided to send me away. You've heard of the New England mother. She had 2 sons. One became a ship's captain out to sea. The other became vice president of the United States. And neither was ever heard from again. Well, Vice President Hobart of New Jersey had died in office during McKinley's first term. And at Philadelphia that summer of 1900, I was nominated to join McKinley's re-election ticket. Nearly unanimously, every vote but one. My own. I said I would rather be a history professor than be vice president, but once nominated, took the duty. Importantly, I campaigned 16,000 miles by train in the western states, while President McKinley famously campaigned on his front porch in Canton, Ohio. The train cars of voters coming to see him there. We were elected by the narrowest of, by a rather healthy margin against William Jennings Bryan, the boy orator of Nebraska, and his vice presidential candidate, Adlai Stevenson I, grandfather of the subsequent Democratic nominee. He'd been vice president under Grover Cleveland in his second term. Mark Hanna, the Republican chairman, McKinley's mentor, he told his fellow Republicans, "Don't you realize what you've done? That madman cowboy is but one life from the presidency." And he told McKinley, "Your job is to stay alive for 4 years." Sad our history. In Buffalo, New York, that September 6th, President McKinley, after having visited Niagara Falls and spoken at the Pan American Expo, he was greeting visitors at the Pan American Expo at the Temple of Music. A man made his way through the line with what appeared to be a bandage wrapped about his hand. And when President McKinley extended his hand in peace and fellowship, that cowardly anarchist, Leon Czolgosz, shot the president twice in the abdomen. I'd been at a fish and game dinner at Isle La Motte on Lake Champlain, just about to address the Vermont Fish and Game dinner. The phone rang, the only phone on the island. It was word from Buffalo. I raced by boat to Burlington, by train to Buffalo. After some days, President McKinley's physicians assured me and the assembling cabinet members that he would recuperate from his wounds. It was thought that it would do the nation's anxiety and Wall Street's anxiety some good if I went on a planned vacation with my family, awaiting me in the Adirondacks. I remember the trip well. My son Ted Jr. shot his first buck. I did no hunting. I climbed Mount Marcy, the highest point in New York State. It's called the Cloud Splitter by the locals, and the Cloud Splitter lived up to its nickname. When we reached the apex, all of the clouds and the fog dissipated, and I saw for 360 degrees around the high peaks and the fresh waters of the Adirondacks. Coming down, having lunch of oxtail on knife point out of the can at Lake Tyr-the-Clouds, the source waters of the Hudson. There, a hunting guide known to me, racing through the woods. Certainly bad news from Buffalo. It was from the cabinet. The president was dying, and I was needed there. Unfortunately for President McKinley, the two physicians treating his wounds were both obstetricians, neither of whom had ever treated a gunshot wound in his practice. By the time I reached North Creek Depot along the Hudson, there another telegram waiting for me. At 2:15 that morning, September 14th, President McKinley had died in Buffalo. I was now your president. I raced to Buffalo to take the oath of office in a borrowed suit of clothes, without a Bible at hand, in the Wilcox Mansion on Delaware Avenue. I simply stated beforehand that it would be my aim that the policies of the McKinley administration for the peace, prosperity, and honor of the American people would remain entirely unbroken. I hoped that I might have left my campground cleaner than I found it, that there might be something about the Roosevelt administration that you might still appreciate today. I'm given a great deal of credit, perhaps too much credit, for the national parks. Our first national park? All right, everybody's watching Kevin Costner these days, right? 1872, our first national park, the first national park in the world. And it took an act of Congress to name a national park. There were 5 when I became your president. I doubled the number to 10. Has anyone here enjoyed Crater Lake National Park in Oregon? Deepest natural lake in North America, 1,942 feet deep. An ancient volcano collapsed in its cone, filled by eons of melted snow. Mesa Verde, the Pueblo Indian ruins in Colorado, one of my national parks. Thank you. It's this program brought to you by Proud Source, spring water. When I went to Africa after my, thank you, Bergie. When I went to Africa after my presidency, I was collecting specimens for the National Museum of Natural History and their collection. I'd be gone. I wanted to give Taft room to grow into the office, so to say. But when we left New York Harbor, my son Kermit and I, my great challenging nemesis, J.P. Morgan, he held a little luncheon in his library in New York City, and he toasted our venture thusly: "To the Lions, may they do their duty." Well, during my presidency, I was able to name with Congress Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota, Platte National Park in Oklahoma, at the hot springs nearby Sulphur. That, when Cousin Franklin and Congress dammed the Chickasaw River and created Lake Arbuckle, that became Chickasaw National Recreation Area, though I don't see much value in recreation if it means zooming about a quiet lake in a powerboat, disturbing the birds. To each their own. My 5th national park is in North Dakota, and it's not Theodore Roosevelt National Park, from which I've come. I'm now a resident of Medora, North Dakota, gateway to Theodore Roosevelt National Park, and soon the home of Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library. My 5th national park is in more east-central North Dakota at Devil's Lake. It was called Sully's Hill National Park, after General Alfred Sully, the Indian fighter. Also an explorer, he's the officer who first went to North Dakota's Badlands and reported back to the War Department that the Badlands looked like hell with the fires put out. I wrote that they looked the way Edgar Allan Poe sounded. I was a bit of a literary fella. But in any case, Sully's Hill became a game preserve under the Fish and Wildlife Service. Recently, the name changed to White Horse Hill in honor of the Spirit Lake Sioux who live nearby. There's not much that recommends Sully's Hill, as bucolic as it is. It's no Yellowstone or Yosemite, Glacier or Teton in scope or scale, but some things in American politics have not changed. The entire time that I was your president, the chairman of the United States Senate Public Lands Committee with jurisdiction over the creation of national parks was Senator Henry Clay Hansborough
of Devil's Lake, North Dakota. You still call that bringing home the bacon, don't you? More than the national parks, perhaps I should be known for the national forests. There were 50 million acres of national forests when I became your president, 200 million acres when I left the White House as a result of the Forest Reserve Act of 1893, which allowed the president to name certain public lands as national forests. There weren't many federally owned lands in the eastern states, but because the Navy grew the tall pines for the center masts on the old wooden boats, I was able to name the Ocala National Forest in 1908 as the second national forest east of the Mississippi. In 1910, as a result of the advocacy of organizations like mine, Boone and Crockett, we were able to pass the Weeks Act, sponsored by Congressman Weeks in 1910, that made it possible for the eastern forest to be purchased with federal monies given to private landowners. Hence the Vanderbilt selling us the Pisgah National Forest nearby to Asheville and more. The great presidential forests of the East, the Washington, the Jefferson, the Daniel Boone National Forest come from the Weeks Act. In 1907, we created the United States Forest Service. The lumber industry bristled at all of this increased interest in federal regulation of the forests, requiring for the first time that the lumber industry actually pay a small royalty for the value of a portion of the lumber they were harvesting to the public treasury. So in 1907, Senator Fulton of Oregon, representing the lumber industry, he passed successfully an amendment to the Agricultural Appropriations Bill that stripped from me and all future presidents the executive authority to name any more national forests in the 5 great forested states of America's Northwest: Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming. I had to sign that bill. But before the deadline for that bill came, Pinchot, our national forester, came to the White House. We covered the windows with heavy muslin. We burned the midnight oil. We sent for the Western surveys. And the night before I had to sign that greater bill, I signed into existence 16 million more acres of national forests in those self-same states. They're still known as the Great Midnight Forests. Congress turned handsprings in their wrath. My fellow Republican, Speaker of the House Joe Cannon of Danville, Illinois, he who had famously said, "Not 1 cent for scenery," after my executive order, he said of me, "President Roosevelt has as much use for the Constitution as a tomcat has for a marriage license." I said the Constitution's made for the people, not the people for the Constitution. Not my last dust up in calling for the preservation of our natural wonders that I would have with Congress. In 1906, Congress passed the Monuments and Antiquities Act. Congressman John Fletcher Lacey of Oskaloosa, Iowa, he who had given us the Lacey Act of 1900, which made it a federal crime to hunt game illegally in one state and transport that game across state lines. In 1906, he gave us the Monuments and Antiquities Act, which delegated from Congress to the President the executive authority to name certain public lands of historic, prehistoric, or scientific interest as national monuments. I first assigned national monument declarations in 1906 to declare Devil's Tower in Wyoming a national monument, eventually doing quite a favor to the film career of Richard Dreyfuss. Mount Olympus in Washington, later under Cousin Franklin, Olympic National Park. Lassen Volcano in California. Montezuma's Castle in the Petrified Forest in Arizona. Jewel Cave in South Dakota. In 1903, touring the country, I saw for the first time in my life the Grand Canyon of the Colorado River in then Arizona Territory. Have you seen the Grand Canyon? Good, we saved it for you. When I saw it, I told the people of Arizona Territory, do nothing to it. I said anything that we do to it can only mar it. That the ages had been at work upon it and nothing that we did could improve it. But what we could do is preserve it for our children and our children's children as the one great sight which every American able to do so should see. When I returned to Congress, I requested that Congress name the Grand Canyon a national park. And each and every year, Congress refused. I don't mean to upset your modern sensibilities, but in my day, there were members of Congress working hand in pocket with special interests on Wall Street. Perhaps I'm not offending your modern sensibilities on this point. Can you imagine what a crime it would be today if the Grand Canyon were a giant copper mining operation? If at night the rim of that canyon was surrounded by the lights of hotels and casinos? In 1908, when Congress still refused to name the Grand Canyon a national park, I used the Monuments and Antiquities Act to declare the entire Grand Canyon a national monument. More than the parks and the monuments and the forests, and in kinship with what we're doing here at Ding Darling, perhaps I should even be better associated with our national wildlife refuges. The year was 1903. Now, I had a lifelong fascination with birds, an amateur ornithologist, and that year, 1903, early in the year, January and February, I was deluged with letters of protest from Florida, from members of the Florida Audubon Society, the Ornithological Union, Dr. Frank Chapman, the head of the Ornithological Unit at the American Museum of Natural History, complaining that for another season, millions of nesting birds would be slaughtered and their nestlings left to starve. All that mostly women might wear the feathers of those dead birds on their hats and on their dresses, sometimes wearing entire dead birds as adornment. There's no explaining fashion. But greed is comprehensible. An ounce of white egret feathers was worth more than an ounce of gold. And motivated by avarice, the poachers, the plume hunters, they set about the slaughter of the birds for the fashion industry, opposed by the game wardens. Here, during my administration in Florida, 2 deputy sheriffs conducting their duties as Florida Audubon game wardens were murdered by poachers. Guy Bradley and Columbus McLeod, Presley Reeves in South Carolina murdered as well. Those 3 names are the first names that appear on the Law Enforcement Memorial at the United States Fish and Wildlife Service Training Center in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, where I've had the pleasure of spending some time with volunteers from the Ding Darling Wildlife Society. It's where the Friends get their training at a little place up there called Roosevelt Hall. So if I'm remembered for the legacy of conservation, perhaps it should be for our wildlife refuges. For I asked my Attorney General, was there anything in the laws of the Constitution which would prohibit me from naming Pelican Island, a small mangrove island in the Atlantic, 3 to 5 acres depending upon the storms, off the coast of Sebastian, north of Vero Beach, south of Melbourne, federally owned? Was there anything that would prohibit me from naming that a federal bird sanctuary? It was at the time the last nesting place of the brown pelican on the Atlantic. My Attorney General hemmed and hawed and said there's no express prohibition. I said I thus declare it. The first of 51 bird sanctuaries declared during my administration, now regarded as the first 51 wildlife refuges, and amongst those, Pine Island, Island Bay, and Matlacha Pass, now constituent parts of Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. A great treasure. Fully. Well, careful now. That's incentive for a politician to keep talking. I hope I left my campground cleaner than I found it. I hope that you'll find some of my legacy something that you might like to share with your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren. I do think I'm being forgotten. I was recently at my namesake high school in Los Angeles, California, Theodore Roosevelt High School. The students there are the Rough Riders. My pictures and quotations adorn each and every hallway and classroom. When I arrived there, I was in my formal wear. I had my top hat. One young man pointed at me. He said to his friends, he said, "Look, there's the Monopoly dude." Quite humbling for an old politician, I assure you. And if he knew his history half as well as you, he would have known I was the anti-Monopoly dude, the great trustbuster. No, I don't think I am remembered for what I thought my greatest accomplishment, a bit of ditch digging in the Isthmus, the Panama Canal. It had been a vision of mankind since the explorations of Balboa 4 centuries prior to my administration. Completed in 1914, it cut to 1/3 the amount of time necessary to move our great naval assets from one ocean to the other. Not unrelated to it, the steaming around the world of the Great White Fleet. 16 battleships painted white, the color of peace, and in circumnavigating the globe accomplished what no Spanish, Dutch, or English armada had ever accomplished before. In the final weeks of my administration, we used to inaugurate on March 4th rather than January 20th. On February 12th, Lincoln's birthday in 1909, I dedicated the National Historic Site, his birthplace in Hodgensville, Kentucky. And on February 22nd, Washington's birthday, I welcomed the Great White Fleet as it returned to Hampton Roads, Virginia, a fitting capstone for my administration. I must admit, though, I don't think I'm remembered for the Nobel Peace Prize for settling the Russo-Japanese War with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Not for my Medal of Honor for leading the charge up Kettle Hill, July 1st, 1898 in Cuba. Not for the Pew Food and Drug Act, or federal meat inspection, or railroad rate regulation, or trust busting. All of it so much dust in the windy streets of history. I think I'm actually best remembered for the legacy of a failure. A failed bear hunt in the delta of Mississippi in 1902. I'd been invited thither to help settle a boundary dispute. In those days, the Mississippi River flooded annually, and when the waters receded, new little islands or abutments of land would be created. And the neighboring states of Mississippi and Louisiana would argue about who had jurisdiction, more likely who had the right to tax for purposes of revenue these newly created lands. I brought down to settle the dispute and to have a good bear hunt, which we did not have, because my friends from Louisiana and Mississippi attempted to outdo one another with regards to the expression of Southern hospitality. Those of you who hunt understand you can either have a good hunt or a good picnic. You generally cannot have them both at the same time in the same place. I'm sure we scared every bear out of the Delta. On the third night, the famous hunting guide, Holt Collier, he came to camp. He said, "Mr. President, I shall have you a bear by morning if we need to bring him into camp on the end of a rope." At that date, Mr. Collier had over 1,000 bear to his record. He, during the Civil War, had been body servant to his master. He'd been a slave. During the Union occupation of Vicksburg, Mr. Collier killed a Union captain. Charges dismissed by a sympathetic Southern jury. Mr. Collier and I were out early the next morning, but we found no spoor, no trail whatsoever, returning to camp, where later from my tent I heard men yelling, dogs barking, a man blowing a bugle. I raced out from my tent, and there indeed, Mr. Collier had tethered an old wounded male bear to a tree. The bear had been cornered by his hunting dogs. The bear killed two of the hunting dogs. The bear was greatly wounded on its chest by the dogs, and when the dogs were harassing the bear, Mr. Collier wanted to save his prized dogs, but fearing to fire his rifle, he went into the shallow water in which the bear and the dogs are wrestling, and he broke the barrel of his gun across the bear's head. The bear was bleeding from a great gash and wound on its head. When the bear was dazed by the blow, Mr. Collier tied one end of his lariat around the bear's neck, dove and tied the other end to a tree. And this horrific scene was the scene upon which I came rushing from my tent. My horror compounded when one in my hunting party said, "Mr. President, there's your bear. Go ahead and shoot your bear." What a cowardly thing that would have been to do. I had founded Boone and Crockett a decade and a half before. I refused to shoot that bear. The story embarrassingly spread throughout the country. The cartoonist Clifford Berryman, my friend, did me no favor when he drew a cartoon of the incident, called it Drawing the Line in Mississippi. The cartoon showed me refusing to shoot a small bear cub tied to a tree. When I returned to the White House, I received there a letter from the Mictum family, small candy makers, toy manufacturers in Brooklyn, New York. Mrs. Mictum, in her letter to me, asking permission to make a stuffed bear and to name it after me. I wrote back, I said, "You may go ahead and do so, but I don't think it will help your sales very much at all." I wonder if any of you have known the love and comfort of what then was called Teddy's bear, with the apostrophe possessive S. Apparently the sales for which were pretty good because the Mictums became the world-famous Ideal Toy Company of New York City. The toy manufacturers, enthused by the unexpected profits that came from the sale of Teddy's bear, they thought they might equally profit if they made a stuffed animal and named it in honor of each and every subsequent resident of 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, the White House. But I'm afraid in honor of William Howard Taft and for the toy manufacturers, America's mothers never really took kindly to putting Billy the Possum in with the children at night. The teddy bear reigns supreme. I've got this little teddy bear who's been traveling with me. That's the Jimi Hendrix portion of this stage. Thank you kindly. That's a little something for my friends from Minot, North Dakota. Next, in a fortnight, we're going to be in Minot, North Dakota, named for my friend Henry Minot. And the gentleman's going to join me. He's a graduate of a school that will celebrate 1 century, Theodore Roosevelt Elementary School in Minot, North Dakota. We'll see you there. All right. Now for the nice lady from just north of Wisconsin. We've got a badger in the house. I am the president, by the way, that saved college football in America. There's the Michiganders, right? Who's rooting for Michigan? All right. Who's rooting for Ohio? So William Howard Taft, his son Robert Taft, ran for the presidency from Ohio. He ran in 1952 against Eisenhower. Eisenhower, the leader of the Allied forces, an internationalist. Taft, a traditional Republican isolationist. The press thought they'd have a little something on Taft. They asked him his foreign policy, and that Buckeye senator said, "Beat Michigan." In 1905, I held a conference at the White House. I invited college presidents and football coaches. Famously, Walter Camp, considered the father of modern football, a player coach at Yale, built the program at Stanford. We've got a Yale Bulldog in the audience there. Bully for you. You want to come demonstrate some football with me? Well, the game was much different and much more violent then. It was 5 yards for a first down instead of 10. The forward pass was illegal. The game was this horribly violent scrum in which the boys did horrible things to one another, especially if they thought they were out of the sight of the umpire. There was a game called the flying wedge, by which the offense would start at a run from 20 yards away from the line of scrimmage, forming themselves in the shape of a wedge, putting the biggest and strongest boys at the point of the wedge and aiming that at what they perceived to be the weakest point of the defense. The defense required to await the collision at the line of scrimmage. When the collision occurred, very often the smallest boy on the offense inside of the wedge would be given the ball and taken bodily by his teammates and thrown over the defense, sometimes accomplishing the entire 5 yards in a first down. Boys had handles sewn into the uniforms to assist in the throwing. Well, on the other side, the boy might land on his head or his neck. Boys would drop with a heavy knee behind the neck. Can you imagine the game of college football, if played today, if 10, 12, or 15 or more boys were being killed or grievously injured every year, as they were then on the college and semi-pro gridirons? So I said, men, the game is on trial. Unless you come up with rules for the safety of the players, the game may be outlawed. My alma mater, Harvard, had discontinued the game the prior year. The state of Georgia considered legislation to outlaw the game. The parents of a boy deceased on the college football field came to the state capitol to testify against the legislation. Their boys so loved the game. I said I would rather keep the game with the violence than lose the game altogether. After all, life is like football. No flinching, no fouling, and hit the line hard. Chastised, those men went away, held more meetings. In 1906, new rules for football. 10 yards for a first down. The forward pass now legal. That was the beginning in 1906 of the National Collegiate Athletic Association. The highest award of the NCAA is the Theodore Roosevelt Public Service Award, given to some Division I athlete who goes on to live a life of public service. Those of you from Minnesota might enjoy the fact that Walter Page, the Purple People Eater of the Minnesota Vikings, a member of the Minnesota State Supreme Court and a winner of the Teddy. Well, Milwaukee. October 14th, 1912. By this time, I was the Progressive Party candidate for the presidency. I'd earlier told the press that I was stripped to the waist like a boxer or wrestler, that I was healthy as a bull moose, and that my hat was in the ring. The first time that phrase from pugilism was used to declare a candidacy. The Progressive Party nominated me in Chicago after the Republican nomination was stolen in that same city. Not the first nor the last time that something politically was stolen in Chicago. In Chicago, as the Progressive Party, my nomination was seconded by Jane Addams, the great social reformer of Chicago's Whole House, herself a future Nobel Peace Prize laureate. Women's suffrage was a part of our 1912 platform, unlike the two major parties. I said, we stand at Armageddon and we battle for the Lord. Onward, Christian Soldier was our theme song. Some say the Ten Commandments and the Golden Rule are platforms. That morning in Milwaukee, I left the Hotel Kilpatrick. I ascended an open-air automobile. I turned and waved to the enthusiastic crowd outside the hotel. When I did so, a madman reached in the automobile and shot me at close range with a .38 caliber. The bullet pierced my overcoat, my folded speech, my steel eyeglass case, lodged deep in my chest, knocked me down in the automobile which I was riding, and cracked a rib. I stood and first made sure that no vigilante justice was done to the madman that shot me. But then, being a hunter and a former soldier, I knew to spit into my palm and to check my spittle. There was no blood in my spittle. My lung was not punctured. It was but a mere flesh wound. I refused medical attention. I demanded to go and make my speech to the thousands awaiting at the auditorium. The automobile took me thither. I climbed upon the stage. I pulled my jacket to the side. I showed the audience my bloody blouse. I said, you must bear with me. You may not understand. You must be quiet. I've just been shot. But it takes more than a bullet to kill a bull moose. I spoke for 80 minutes with a bullet in my chest. And right now, half of you are wondering what it will take to get me to stop hollering at you in the sunshine here at the Roost for Ding Darling. Right? Well, keep your eyes on the stars and your feet planted firmly on the ground. Believe you can? And you're halfway there. for yourselves, for your community here, for your communities back home. Do what you can with what you have where you are. Godspeed and welcome one and all to Ding Darling National Wildlife Refuge. Bully, Lieutenant Colonel William Harkey, United States Army, retired. Sir, Bully.
Always a pleasure, Mr. President. Always a pleasure.
Terrific, fantastic. Bully.
And he's 166 years old. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being here. Again, if you have